you mentioned 2%, 20% over X years. Are you saying that this inflationary pressure? I mean, I know how you're structured, how your thinking is structured, and it has to do with options. Is this a type of end game that's going to be the frog being boiled slowly, or is this going to be a massive one-time, two-time, three-time event that either
you accept
you're prepared for it or
right?
you're not?
This is the key question. Central banks are crossing their fingers that the frogs will stay in the water, and they can engineer some sort of they can basically deflate their way out of the problem quietly and nobody really noticing. The problem is this is a relative and contagious game. Okay, if you think about monetary policy and the effectiveness of monetary policy, they sell it to us as a domestic decision. Think about QE in the US, right? It's broadly being sold to the world as a big success. How did it work? Okay, we had a problem. So Mr. Citibank, Mr. Bank of America, Mr. Goldman Sachs, whatever, guys, they sit everybody around the table in 2008 and said, how big's your hole? 100 billion, 150 billion, 200 billion. Okay, 600 billion problem. Let's print 700. Problem solved. We print the money, we give it to these guys, and everybody was like screaming, oh my God, you're printing money, inflation's gonna go through the moon and blah, 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 okay? And that QE1 was incredibly effective because it cut that tail risk on the downside, it avoided the systemic stuff. It was needed and justified. The problem was with QE2 and then QE3, so-called QE infinity. You know, you start, it's subject to the law of diminishing returns. So you had to print way bigger size to the point that QE3 was, I'll do whatever it takes. It's not good enough. If we just say 3 trillion, then the market will ignore it. And then guess what happened? Whilst the US is printing its way out, it sends euro dollar to 150. Alongside with it, you have dollar China pegged. So guess what? Europe ends up being the good citizen. It was hiking rates in the middle of Bernstein's blowing up, right? And basically, you have a situation where Europe loses enormous competitiveness versus both the US and China. Surprise, surprise. 4 years later, Europe blows up. Of course it blows up. It had its own issues, but it effectively blew up because of the US passing some of these problems to Europe. So when Draghi walks in and says, I'll do whatever it takes, he says, I'll do whatever it takes to save the euro and send it to parity. What do you need to do? What do you need to do to send the euro to parity? Negative interest rates. Zero interest rates was not enough. We would have never had negative interest rates in Europe if the Fed had been at 2%. And this is my point, that monetary is relative and contagious. The problem is everybody's doing the same thing. And look at it now. I mean, the biggest driver in global markets today, we're not in risk on, risk off. We're not in inflation on and off. It's long dollar or short dollar. That's the driver. Everything's moving like that. And the minute, I mean, obviously the US, both the Fed and the US government have plenty of room to engineer a devaluation of the dollar. I mean, 10-year treasury yields are still 67 basis points, and the 30 years 140. They have huge amount of room to send this to zero. They have huge amount of room, but they just need a handshake and get 2.2 trillion of fiscal expansion by increasing the debt and diluting the dollar further. They have huge amount of room to do it. It's so consensus and so obvious what's happening that the market gets very carried away, and then obviously euro dollar goes to 120 and Europe, guys, we're watching. We've seen this movie before. The problem is, what else can Europe do? Dude, you're already at negative rates. You already have, you know, this huge spend, and so this process, unfortunately for Europe, it's screwed, because if we send the euro dollar to 120, 125, 130, not only you have all these underlying issues, now you're losing competitiveness, and then you blow up and the euro goes down because you blew up even more. And so this is the point I'm making, that we're not really solving anything. Everybody is in the right mind thinking, oh, if let's solve. And there was a question in the intergenerational debate. Most of the problems in life are trade-offs between short-term and long-term. I want to eat this cake, but I'll be fat. I want to have fun now, but then I want to do this. So same thing. It's very human nature.
And in comes COVID, right? In comes COVID and accelerates and exacerbates a lot of the problems that we've been seeing since the crisis and everything that monetary authorities have had to do. And now monetary policy is exhausted. They need fiscal policy. It seems like it's one of the few bipartisan agreements in the US. Europe needs to do it as well. How do you see the lack of cohesion? I mean, Germany took steps recently to sort of allow there to be some form of fiscal union, not exactly, but they're working their way towards that. Whereas the US, I think, might have power to spend more fiscally. How do you see that dynamic at play, and maybe how Japan and China, the other two major poles, might interact in terms of where we go from here?
Well, look, very different dynamics. I think the US is the most dynamic, and they have more room monetarily. They have plenty of room still. And obviously, a shake of hands gives you this, whereas in Europe, you have all sorts of issues, which, to be honest, they are there for the right reasons. Okay, thanks God. I mean, otherwise in Spain would be, Venezuela by now. Thanks God there's someone like watching you and making sure you're not abusing this. So they're good safety mechanisms that prevent you from going completely nuts and crazy. So I think the problem here is that the guys that behave properly are being penalized. And from a game theory perspective, what do I do? Do I do the right thing and stay orthodox and stuff, or I need to defend myself? And so I think the US has a very dynamic, very powerful setup that can lead to this weaker dollar. Europe has more barriers, which are there for the right reasons, but Europe has learned the lesson from 2008, and I think it's been very proactive. They could see this coming. I mean, it's not a coincidence that you have Lagarde and De Guindos at the top of the ECB. They're both ex-finance guys. Okay, they knew that the next phase was fiscal, and therefore you put the right guys to be able to do this. And I think Japan is a slightly different story, but perhaps to touch on China and to spice things up a little bit in terms of controversy, I think it's, in my humble opinion, one of the biggest bubbles in history. And right now you have this perception of the yuan being a stable currency, pretending to position itself as a safe haven currency or whatever. It's not as easy as that. I think the model that they've run, they know exactly what they need to do, but every time a crisis comes, they go back to, they know what to do. I need to quit smoking, but every time something goes wrong, they go, it's what's happening, right? So every single crisis is met by more of the same. They print, they lend, they nationalize, and it was interesting. Recently, there was a tweet, where they were basically, the tweet read that they were injecting $7 billion into the Chinese banks. And I said, no, they're not. They're injecting 50 billion yuan. It's a very different thing. You can print 50 billion yuan or a gazillion bolivars, okay, and you can inject them in the banks and pretend there's no problem. The reality is you're not really fixing stuff, okay? You are diluting this. And I think when you have a closed system and this dynamic where, you want the economy to grow at 8.8, we're going to build more roundabouts and more stuff and more, it rings the bell. I mean, we saw that in without the central government. We saw this liquidity flowing like water into infrastructure and real estate bubbles in Spain, and we knew what happened. And here you have similar situation to a much larger scale. But I think it's all artificial, and I think the degree of freedom, it's a big devaluation of the yuan, but it's all the same. We keep going back in circles where this dynamic where you have problems, you're not willing to take the hit. The easiest thing is to print a bit more and lend a bit more, and this becomes something that is, once it reaches the point of no return, which I think it's way past for places like Japan or Europe, then it's very difficult to unwind. And when I wrote the book, I had a chapter on the anti-bubbles. I love this book from L. Ariane called The Only Game in Town. And he introduced the concept that it was new for me at the time, is the idea of a pre-mortem analysis. Okay, we're all very familiar with the concept of post-mortem, right? So a building collapses and you send the engineers and they look at it and they say, oh, the pillars were done of this material, and then the heat and the humidity, and oh, this is what happened, right? But there's something called the pre-mortem analysis, which is the building standing and we just go, the building just collapsed. No, it didn't. Is there? No, it just did. Okay, it just did. And then suddenly, oh, it just collapsed. And you start developing, how could this collapse, right? So when you think of this, is an incredibly powerful framework. Okay, you could use it to anything you want. My wife will never leave me. And then it's like, she just did. It's like, oh shit, whatever bad thing you want to think about. This pre-mortem analysis applied to global markets was, what do we need to do to get out of this? What do we need to see for the world to normalize? Okay, and the path required was effectively the normalization of monetary policy. And Q4 2018 was the moment when, boom, the bluff became obvious. The US tried to normalize. We went from four hikes to 4 cuts, someone like Goldman, right? In a week. Okay, people thought, oh, this is normal, we can normalize. No, you can't normalize. And ever since, we've had a set of preemptive policies where central banks are trying to stay ahead of the curve, because the minute this thing goes a little bit out of control, and COVID was an example, it's boom, it's game over. And it keeps getting bigger. So it's very I'm sorry if my analogy was unfortunate, but anyway, you can use it.
No. I mean, like, the question is, you mentioned how Japan was a point of no return. The question is, given what you just said, isn't the US at a point of no return as well? And if not, then how could they turn the ship around?
It is now. It is now.
And if they could, like, do you see any way for them, for this whole scenario to turn around? Because time and time again, in the global macro space, you see this fear of, like, it's going to end today. In 2009, I heard this narrative. I've heard it my whole career, and we're kind of, I'm seeing the pain points now after COVID. They've always found a way, right?
Yeah,
whatever it takes. Whatever it takes.
The thing is, I'm a very cynical, contrarian, and I would say that rule number 1 of the investment game is they will change the rules. Okay, so the reason we thought, you're talking about 2009 with a mindset, which is, these were the rules of the game. I mean, think about, at that point in time, someone told you we were going to have $17 trillion of debt at negative yields. You would have, I don't know if you would have laughed or cried, but you've been like, no way. I mean, what are you talking about? And today, no one's blinking, right? So how far can you go? And by the way, I think the comment on crypto, I'm very skeptical. Okay, I don't want to come across. I'm not. I'm a big believer in technology. I'm not necessarily a big believer. Even if I think the technology has lots of merits, I am so cynical that I know exactly how valuable this is for central banks and governments, and why they're not going to let this precious thing called seigniorage go away. Seigniorage is the difference between how much it costs you to create a $100 note and how much it's worth. And this privilege is, they're not going to let it go by creating. So something as easy as making these things illegal and you go to jail or whatever. I mean, I think at least twice in history, we've seen governments apply death penalty for not accepting paper currency. Death penalty. I mean, when people ask me, "Oh my God, yeah, crypto," okay, what could central banks do? How far could they go? Death penalty. It's happened. Okay, this is how desperate central banks are. So it's a very tricky situation for where we're going. But I think to your point, the rules keep changing and they keep going, but they're not solving the problems. We're creating way bigger and bigger and bigger problems. And this is why I think Ray Dalio and to a point earlier in equality, the really sad thing about all these people that you were saying that they're very unhappy and revolts, which I agree with you, there's a common denominator. No one will point the central banks as guilty. No one. Absolutely nobody. They will blame and they will find scapegoats, and let's see what Trump comes up with next. But it's this bully mentality of it's always somebody else's fault and finding people to blame. This is a situation where it's like a movie of Hollywood where the bad guy of the movie is the policeman. I mean, the central bank #1 job is financial stability of the system. That's the job. Dude, you need to keep the financial stability of the system. Yet, they've created the biggest bubble in financial history.
Yeah, and so they're not elected officials. You have all of this power in appointed officials. You have this massive regulatory hazard that is layered on top of this, which is a whole nother interesting dynamic.